Maybe he had two editions of Quixote that came out. So I'm guessing. Since both dates fall within the latter part of his life. I was just looking for a good picture with the dates.
All right.
Okay, here we go.
Yep, sorry about that.
Renaissance times. Last time we were looking at the different writers, and we're going to finish that up tonight. Last time we looked at John Milton, and prior to that, Shakespeare. I hope that our discussion of Shakespeare was interesting for you. I don't know if I said this enough in talking about Shakespeare, that my perspective on the author of the Shakespearean plays is much debated, but I think I'm right. So Cervantes, he's the Spanish author, and in his work Don Quixote, he ridiculed feudal society. Spain was a little behind the rest of Europe even in that, as feudalism had been coming to an end for some time in the rest of Europe. But he especially was ridiculing knighthood and chivalry and all that in his masterpiece. And you can see that as you look at, as you read the book. So here's a little bit of information about him if you want to glance down through that. Yeah, 1606, it was published.
Wikipedia says it was published in two parts, 1605 and 16.
Ah, okay.
That's what DQ stands for.
Yeah. And he also wrote some other things. How many of you have read Don Quixote or at least part of it? Anybody? Okay. I assume all of you are familiar with Don Quixote, you know something about it. What do you think of when you hear Don Quixote? What? Windmills. Fighting against windmills. In fact, you know, this is why it's important for people, and I'm thinking especially young people, to be familiar with classic literature, because there are references that come from classical works of literature in other literature, or even plays, movies, television, whatever. And so a term like fighting against windmills, you know, if you're not familiar with Don Quixote, you won't have any idea what that expression means. Or even the term Quixotic. I've seen that lots of times, that someone was Quixotic. I mean, it's like Don Quixote. He's got his head in the clouds. He's an idealist, things like that. But fighting the windmills was something that stands out from that work. Anybody remember the name of his sidekick? He had a sidekick who rode a burro. Don Quixote was on a nag, and his sidekick, Sancho Panza, was, and then there was a prostitute that he thought was a fair maiden, and my mind is not bringing that name up. Anybody? No? Okay, this is a quote from Don Quixote. If thou art not versed in the business of adventures, get thee aside and pray, whilst I engage these giants in combat. Referring to the windmills, thought they were giants. And there was a musical written from Don Quixote called Man of La Mancha. I just thought of this as we were talking beforehand. I didn't think to put it in the presentation, but one very famous song came from that, and probably more, but here's the one.
Fight the unbeatable foe.
You hear it?
Bear with unbearable sorrow. To run where the brave dare not go. To right the unrightable wrong. To love pure and chaste from afar. To try when your arms are too weary. To reach the unreachable star. This is my quest to follow that star, no matter how hopeless, no matter how far, to fight for the right without question or pause, to be willing to march into hell for a heavenly cause. And I know if I'll only be true, that my heart will lie peaceful and calm when I'm laid to my rest. And the world will be better for this. That one man, scorned and covered with scars, still strong with his last ounce of courage. The unreachable star.
There. You familiar with that? Are you not? I think there's some other songs from that too that became popular. So Cervantes, worth reading. Any questions or comments? Oh, I've got some quotes from him. He's I thought this is interesting. Do not eat garlic or onions, for their smell will reveal that you are a peasant. Because that's all peasants could, afford, yeah. So
Not very down.
I would say don't eat them because you'll annoy everybody around you. Reminds me of a guy that used to come to a Bible study that I had going. I don't know if you know where Steel Street is, where Steel Street hits Mahoning. I knew a guy that owned a building there, and he consented to allow some of us to have a Bible study, and we were hoping to maybe reach the people of that area. But anyway, there was a guy that came to that Bible study, very knowledgeable guy, but he would eat several cloves of garlic before he came to the Bible study. You could smell the garlic walking into the building. It was so strong. And for those that were sitting next to him, it was unbearable. Finally, one of the young ladies said, "Joe, you got to stop eating that garlic. I can't stand it." He should have read Cervantes. Here's a couple more. Forewarned, forearmed. To be prepared is half the victory. I think we've heard that. In order to attain the impossible, one must attempt the absurd. One man scorned and covered with scars still strove with his last ounce of courage to reach the unreachable stars, and the world will be better for this. That's reflected in the song. Great persons are able to do great kindnesses. There were no embraces because where there is great love, there is often little display of it. And I don't know about you, but I found that sometimes where there's a lot of display, maybe there's not so much love. Hate to be a skeptic about that kind of thing, but I found out to be true sometimes. He who loses wealth loses much. He who loses a friend loses more. But he that loses his courage loses all. Feel free to comment on any of these. Oh boy, you find this to be true. There's not the least thing that can be said or done, but people will talk and find fault. And he who sings scares away his woes. Never stand begging for that which you have the power to earn. We need to put billboards up with that.
Yeah.
Maybe I should make cards with that on it, and when I see these people begging alongside the road, just hand it to them. These able-bodied people that are standing there with their signs. A woman's advice has little value, but he who won't take it is a fool. All right, that's Cervantes. Any comments or questions? Okay, now we're going to move to France, to a guy who was called Molière. That's not his real name. That was a stage name. His real name was Jean-Baptiste Poquelin. And he was the leading comic dramatist of French literature. Among his notable plays are The School for Wives, Tartuffe, that's one of his more famous ones. The Misanthrope, The Miser, the Hypochondriac, it translates it here. It's also called The Imaginary Invalid. The Affected Ladies, The School for Husbands, Don Juan, you've heard of that, sure. So these are some of the plays that he wrote. The Imaginary Invalid has a place in my heart. It was during a college production of that play that I had my only acting role prior to my 30s. I played one of the doctors that was treating him. And he himself played the role of the invalid during that production, and it was the last play he was in. He was playing that part. He himself was suffering from pulmonary tuberculosis, and he was seized by a coughing fit and a hemorrhage while playing the hypochondriac. He finished the performance, but collapsed again and died a few hours later. That's Molière. Any comments or questions on him? You ever seen any of his plays? What was it? He had pulmonary tuberculosis.
Play within the play for the Phantom, isn't it?
I don't remember. All I remember is that Don Juan was supposed to be a ladies' man of some kind. I don't remember anything more about it. Imaginary Invalid is quite humorous. This hypochondriac is paying all these doctors to treat him, and they keep making up stuff so they get more money out of him. And he's got some daughters that are in the mix, and I think trying to get themselves married off. I don't recall much about it, except that it is humorous. Okay, let's move on to the visual arts. And we're going to look at the distinctions of Renaissance art and characteristics of Renaissance art. They're going to kind of overlap. First, the characteristics, and there are several here, and then we're going to look at them individually. But the idea of realism, that they're painting things that are the real world, they're three-dimensional instead of flat. They're balanced and ordered. Don't try to get all this down now. We'll go back through them. There's a lot of portraits. Landscapes are painted. And a classical style that is going back to Greek and Roman. And also the depiction of classical themes and stories. So going back to mythology for a lot of the themes of the paintings and stories involved. Okay, so let's look at some of these individually. So the emphasis upon the present physical world. So you see that in the Renaissance, they're painting real people in real situations. And you know, as in contrast to medieval art, which is mostly about the other world, the spiritual world, or heaven, or you know, things like that. So this is just one example of many by Jan van Eyck. So emphasis on the present physical world. Next, there were what needs to be noted is that secular patrons often supported artists. So people that were in business, you know, especially bankers, if you think Florence, other people would support artists either by paying them to paint portraits of themselves, like this guy, or even paying them to paint other things, you know, for their mansions or whatever. The other thing we find is that most artists were proud of their work, desiring that their names be known and their works praised. I know we're going to talk about this again later too, some of the overlap here. This is a small part of the painting of the Sistine Chapel, if I remember correctly, by Michelangelo. This is something I think is really significant. Realistic three-dimensional aspect was given to the works. And this particular painting with what was someone was drawing lines to show perspective here, that you see things in the background, foreground, and they are drawn three-dimensionally so that it looks like there's depth there. It looks like they're not just flat surfaces. So it went from this to this. What a difference, huh? They wanted to be more realistic than the medieval artist and include a perspective and a vanishing point. You can see that clearly, especially in the second one, the vanishing point, how everything, you can see almost the lines going back to the building in the back, showing that perspective. Now, you probably, if you ever took an art class, you probably, or even in grade school, I remember doing this, you know, we were told to, you know, draw telephone poles going back to a distant place, and you drew the lines or railroad tracks, and you drew whatever is in the background is smaller and the thing in the front is larger, and that gives perspective. Again, subjects are realistic. They embrace some of the ideals of Greece and Rome in their art. And then, as I said, there were commissions. People paid privately for artwork to be done. Okay, another distinctive is that most portrait painters frequently painted kings, merchants, and other important secular individuals. So it wasn't all just religious like it had been in medieval times. A lot of people are getting their portraits done. And the most popular form of artistic expression was painting and sculpture. And now some characteristics which distinguish it from other art styles. There is the preponderance of youth in Renaissance painting. Children are more important than they were in medieval art, which if you look at some of the medieval art and see even the infant Jesus, he's got the head of a man. It's like this man head on a baby body. It looks really odd. But in the Renaissance, they began portraying children more accurately, even Jesus. And here's an example of just how many children are in this painting. the portrayal of nature. Because the Renaissance man was more interested in earthly things than in heavenly things, Renaissance artists placed their subjects in realistic settings. Looking closely at many of their works, one can find birds, flowers, animals, insects, pools, trees, mountains, and so on. So they paid a great deal of attention to the detail of the landscapes of nature, even if it's just a backdrop for people that they're putting, or in this case, it's the painting itself is of nature. There was an attention to anatomy. Medieval artists, in an attempt to emphasize the spiritual qualities of their subjects, painted and sculpted them almost as if they had no bodies beneath their robes. Just here's a robe. I'm sure there's a person in here. But the Renaissance artists, on the other hand, were interested in showing their subjects as real persons. Many, like Michelangelo, first sketched their subject in the nude before painting them clothed. In this way, they felt that they would show the correct shape of the person. To learn more about the muscles of the body, some artists dissected cadavers. And so you see these, I think both of these are by Da Vinci. If not, they're like a lot of the drawings that he made. So they start looking at how the muscles are there and all that, and then they also are looking at the internal organs and all the rest. And then there was an emphasis on classicism, or the classic times. Renewed interest in that caused Renaissance artists to paint Roman arches, Greek columns, Roman or Greek ruins, and so on into the background of their paintings. They often painted scenes from Greek and Roman mythology. And this famous painting of the philosophers, he actually has, all these different people in this painting are individual philosophers from Greek and Roman times. And my mind's got blankets. Who painted this? Is it Raphael? I think. He painted himself in there too. Then there's the idea of perspective, which we looked at before. You can see with the famous Mona Lisa, everybody focuses on the woman, especially her smile, but what about the background? There's landscape there. There's shading, which you don't find so much in medieval painting. The use of light, and that especially becomes predominant when we get into the Northern Renaissance with the Dutch. But it's realistic. So this idea of perspective, they sometimes forced architecture into the backgrounds simply to demonstrate that they grasped the concept of perspective. And then there's the emphasis on learning. Renaissance paintings often feature men holding conversations or involved in the study of books. Such works reflect the quest of knowledge, which was so much a part of the Renaissance. In medieval paintings, books symbolized writers. But in the Renaissance, books symbolized the quest for knowledge by everyone, even women. I saw a number of paintings when I was looking for one to use here of women reading books. And then there was individualism and pride. This goes back to a comment I made earlier about pride in their work. Anybody recognize this sculpture? Give you a chance to show off your knowledge of sculpture here. This is La Pieta by Michelangelo. It's the mother of Jesus, Mary, the mother of Jesus, holding him after he was taken down from the cross. Because Renaissance artists were proud of their accomplishments, they signed their works. That didn't really happen in the Middle Ages. This is well illustrated in the story of Michelangelo and the Pietà. French Cardinal Jean de Bellières, who served the church in Rome, wanted to be remembered long after he had died. To achieve this goal, he hired Michelangelo to make a memorial for his tomb that would capture a scene that was popular in Northern Europe, in North European art at the time, which was the tragic moment of the Virgin Mary taking Jesus down from the cross. And actually, that undersells de Bellières' request. Michelangelo's exact job description for the project was to create the most beautiful work of marble in Rome, one that no living artist could better, for his tomb. While other sculptors might have balked at such an intense demand, I mean, if someone says, I want you to create something that no one else would ever be able to create the equal of, that's a rather daunting task. But Michelangelo was confident he could complete such a task. The Pietà is considered by many to be his greatest work, even more so than David and the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. Michelangelo carved the Pietà from a single slab of marble. Specifically, he used Carrara marble, a white and blue stone named for the Italian region where it is mined. Now, if we could get close enough to be able to see it, which we can't in this picture, Michelangelo's signature can be found across Mary's chest. He wanted it to be known who made this greatest sculpture of all time. 16th century art historian Giorgi Vasari told the tale of how Michelangelo made his mark. He said one day, and he calls him Michelagnolo, entering the place where it was set up, found there a great number of strangers from Lombardy who were praising it highly. And one of them asked one of the others who had done it. And he answered, Our Gobbo from Milan. Michelangelo stood silent, but thought it something strange that his labors should be attributed to another. And one night he shut himself in there, and having brought a little light and his chisels, carved his name upon it. So no one would mistake who had done this great sculpture. It is said that he later regretted the vanity of this act and resolved never to sign another piece of his work. But most artists did.
You got it in the papers?
No, you'll have to write on the back anything else that I give you. Sorry. I didn't realize that we were at the end of what I had given. There's just, a few points here and there. We've already talked about balance before. So another characteristic is balance. Many works show a carefully contrived balance. For example, artists place their painted figures in a triangular arrangement. You can see this, especially on the right, where you see the lamb, the sacrificial lamb in the center on an altar, the cross by it, and you can see the triangular shapes around it. I mean, even rays of the sun are coming out in a perspective way, and the buildings in the background and the trees, all this is in perspective and triangular shapes, or even triangles within or defining some of the groups that are there in a way. And then on the left, it's maybe a little harder to see, but the background, the landscaping, or the buildings in the background, the windows, the floor, all that is showing balance and perspective. And the balance is that on the left, you've got a man on one side and a woman on the other. So the whole picture is balanced, and the windows are showing balance. On the right, you have groups of people on opposite sides. In the center, you have different, looks like angels surrounding the altar, and they are equal to one another. You could almost draw a line down the middle and fold it, and there will be similarities on both sides. And you can see this a lot in Michelangelo's paintings in the Sistine Chapel. When we get to him, I hope I'm going to be able to show you a presentation. Beth and I went over to Pittsburgh a year or so ago, where they had reproductions of the paintings of the Sistine Chapel, but instead of craning your neck up to the ceiling to see them at a distance, they're right there and blown up, so you could see the details of all these parts of the paintings that he did there. Remarkable detail, remarkable work, considering that for a lot of it, he's laying on his back on the ceiling and painting things that are such detail that people wouldn't be able to really see from that distance. But balance there as well. So kind of summarize art and then looking ahead to architecture later. These are some of the characteristics, and we've talked about them just to refocus in our minds. The idea of reason, objectivity, there's the discipline involved, order, balance. There's restraint. I'm not sure what the person means by that exactly, but they say it's all summed up in one term. There's harmony. There's harmony in the paintings, in the sculptures. It is a beauty. I think that's one thing that draws us so much to Renaissance art, is just, it's beautiful. No matter the topic. All right, any comments? All right, let's look at some painters. I have to admit to you, I haven't looked at this in a while. But here we go. One of the first, or I should say early Italian painters, really predates the Renaissance. And I kind of think maybe we talked about him a little before. Giotto. He lived primarily in the early part of the 14th century. So that's a good deal of time before most of the Renaissance painters, but he kind of gets it going. And you can see in his painting here that it's not quite what later Renaissance paintings would do, but it's better than what medieval painters were doing. This is called Homage of a Simple Man, St. Francis. He realistically portrayed religious themes in many frescoes. Those are paintings on walls. There was one famous one called St. Francis Preaching to the Birds. So that's Giotto, as far as I know on how to say his name. Okay, the next one is, oh no, there's more by Giotto, I forgot. Trying to remember what this painting is. Oh, it looks like Lazarus. Yeah. Yeah, the raising of Lazarus. But you can see it's not quite the three-dimensional that we were looking at with other paintings, but better than medieval times. Notice, you look at that. Well, look at this. What do you notice that seems maybe more realistic than some of the religious paintings of medieval times? What do you see here? It maybe kind of gives us a foreshadowing of what Renaissance art would become.
There's some 3D to
Yeah. What gives you the 3D effect?
it. Where they're kneeling right there,
Mm-hmm.
you know, there's some rock right there.
Looks like trees in the
And then
background.
it's kind of going back.
Trees and then
going
the tomb
to-
back in here.
You know, the mountain's kind of going back. to-
Yeah. The fact that they're in front of that and then.
And there's some depth to the people too, they're not like all in line. You know.
Yeah, I think, for example, Lazarus's face is not turned flat like even some of the other ones are.
Right,
You can see both eyes.
right.
I noticed this. Let's see there. Wonder if that's Martha. She's the one that said, "For 4 days, surely he stinketh."
Smell.
That medieval halo around the people
Yeah,
isn't quite as prominent or whatever.
yeah, still there,
It's
but
still
not,
there, not as prominent. Yeah.
So this would have been like the forerunners of the Renaissance. It
Yeah,
would have
I
been
think
where
so.
Where it took that leap from, you know, medieval to.
yeah, I think if we looked at Renaissance art chronologically, we would see a progression. At least to a certain point, and then, everybody is kind of doing it. Okay, here's the next guy, Masaccio. Masaccio is in the early 1400s. And he engendered the modern style of art by painting his subjects as lifelike, true, and natural. He wanted to make the Christian faith more tangible and accessible to the common person. So he used simple forms, colorful figures with emphatic gestures, and expressive faces, three-dimensional perspective, and shadows. So you definitely can see this guy's face looks more natural than what we've seen in medieval art. And this one may be a little harder to see because it's small, but I'm sure you can pick out perspective.
Earlier, where it showed the points.
Oh, was it
Yeah,
the same one?
It is, yeah,
Okay,
it is. With the green, with the blue lines.
Yeah. when you
Yeah.
showed the depth.
yeah, and so he's one of the early ones. And I'm sure influenced others that came after. Yeah, and our next Italian is Sandro Botticelli. And he's 1445 to 1510. This painting is 1483, so it's a little bit after Masaccio. And you can see the progress that's being made here. His looks even more realistic than Masaccio. I would say much more realistic than Masaccio. He flourished, Botticelli did, during the golden age of painting. He was also influenced by the priest who became an evangelical preacher, Savonarola. We'll talk about him when we get to looking at the religious movements. But Savonarola's preaching affected him so much that he burned many of his worldly paintings and began to paint more religious subjects. Any observations you would make here?
Looks to me like the people are beginning to have some expressions of emotions
Uh-huh,
in their faces.
yeah.
Wait, what's going on with the closest child next to the lady?
Yeah, I don't know.
Is that like,
Looks like it's blurred there.
is that what it is? Is it blurred?
And it may be just, in blowing it up sometimes
Sure.
that happens, or I can't tell. what that is.
He's a Mandalorian or it kind of looks
Yeah.
like some kind of helmet or something.
Yeah, and what is
It's like a
this?
plane.
Like Mars is dozing off? Are these, no, these have little horns maybe?
Oh, yeah.
So maybe they're imps
Must
or
be something, right?
evil cherubs.
See that.
This is the famous work by Botticelli, The Birth of Venus. Coming out of the, is it clamshell or oyster shell? This is Lamentation over the Dead Christ with the saints Jerome, Paul, and Peter. Now that's not quite realistic, is it? At least for the people that were there. Because the only one of the three that realistically could have been there was Peter. But this is often done in religious paintings even, where they would portray people that came along after in the scenes. But a very realistic portrayal of Christ being dead, his body being handled like that. I'm seeing it's less clear up there even than it is on this screen. So I think just the bigger it gets, the more fuzzy it gets. This is La Primavera. I don't know what that's about.
Sounds like something you'd order at Maracas.
Yeah. Looks like something evil's going on over here. I don't know. Different colored person. Yeah, it looks like like he's picking fruit. Cherub flying up around the top.
Regarding the meeting somehow.
I wonder if prima means first. Vera. Can't think what that. How that would fit. Yeah, maybe. All right, we're going to go now to probably the most famous and most skilled, at least some would say, of the Renaissance artists. And I think primarily we're going to look at his painting now, and that's Leonardo da Vinci. He was a master at so much, and it's called the Renaissance man because he was a painter, a sculptor, architect, engineer, anatomist, inventor. You could put musician, just go on and on with all the different things that he was able to accomplish, his skills. He's the embodiment of the Renaissance ideal of the universal man, the first artist to attain complete mastery over all branches of art. And there, lists them again. Also scholar in natural sciences, medicine, and philosophy. He also excelled in military engineering and devised equipment for scaling walls. I remember reading a letter written by him once to a noble of a town. Basically, it was a job application telling him what he could do for him as a military engineer to protect his city, the different things that he would bring to that job. Of course, she's famous for Mona Lisa, which is oil painting on wood. But behind all of the paintings and sculptures, there are his sketches. Here's the sketches of a horse. And I think this was probably the background for a giant sculpture he did of a horse. Not shouldn't say a sculpture. It wasn't really a sculpture. It came out of a mold. So he would make the mold. I can't remember what the material was that he would make the mold out of. And then they would pour iron or molten iron into it and fill up the mold, just like you would with chocolate or something, and then take as it cooled, then take the frame away, and then you've got your statue there, which is a remarkable thing to me that you can even do that. But I think this was the background for that. So he studied anatomy thoroughly, and facial expressions, as you can see on the right, drawing different kinds of people, different expressions, before you even think about painting or sculpting. From his observations, well, here's some more anatomy. I mean, you think about it, Da Vinci knew more about the human body than the vast majority of doctors from his studies. They didn't know all these things, or how the body was put together. Yeah.
Were some of these drawings a basis for the doctors for study later on?
They were for his.
I know for,
Yeah.
creative, but the
I-
doctors actually use his creations.
I don't know the doctors if they did or not, or even if they were available, because he's doing it so he can do a better job of creating a realistic looking person in a painting or a sculpture. Including plants. From his observations of animals, I don't know if I have a picture of this later or not. He sketched a parachute. He's the one who invented the parachute, at least on paper, and a flying machine. In the late 1400s, early 1500s, he had drawings for a flying machine. I've also seen a drawing of what we call a tank. And although he was probably an agnostic, he painted such religious masterpieces as The Last Supper. Although Mona Lisa is probably his most famous work. As I remember, he was left-handed, and he wrote his notes in such a way that they could only be read with a mirror. But he didn't use a mirror when he was writing it.
Was he dyslexic?
I don't know. I can't imagine the brain process that it would take to do that, to write in a mirror way. I didn't realize I was going to get this far tonight, or I would have even more pictures of his. There's just so much, just in the painting and drawing area, and the sketches. Any other observations about Da Vinci? And this is just painting. We'll come back to other things he did as well. Such great talent. Unfortunately, the unfortunate thing about his painting of the Last Supper, well, for one thing, it's painted on a wall. So I remember probably a couple of decades ago, there was a lot of talk about the fact that it had deteriorated. And so they were trying to, get it back into regular shape, but, it's not like you can take it off the wall and put it someplace. It's on a wall. But the unfortunate thing is that ever after, Jesus and his disciples at the Last Supper have been pictured all sitting on one side of the table, which of course would not happen. Well, for one thing, they weren't sitting. And for another, they wouldn't have all been on the same side of the table. but you can, I don't know whether you can see it well enough to tell who some of the disciples are there. But a noble effort nonetheless. And again, the perspective. Notice how the walls are going back, showing perspective with the back wall, and then back behind the wall, there's a window with landscape behind it. Truly a genius.
Are there, is Judas not there?
I think,
Are there 11? I was trying to count, it only counted 11.
thought it was there, 1, 2, 3. Is there one up there?
Is there one right there?
Or no, that's him. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And 11, 12.
Yeah, there's 6 on that side, so there is another one, I just can't distinguish, you only see
But I
5
think-
heads on that side.
I wonder if that's Judas with his finger up like that. I don't know. Seems to be contrary. And this will be John, who's sitting next to Jesus.
Right.
Maybe Peter whispering to John, ask him who it is.
So where's the other face on that? I see the 5, where's the 6th?
1, 2, 3, 4,
Oh, I see.
5. Yeah,
I
this
didn't
is
see
a
that
little
one.
bit
I
dark.
didn't see that one. That's what I could see.
Mm-hmm. All right, our next artist is Raphael. And there are his dates. Raphael. Good biblical name. Supposedly one of the angels. I think, although people would think it's one of the Ninja Turtles, I suppose. But I trying to remember. I don't think that name is used in the Bible. Do you remember, Brian? But I think it's in First Enoch. As Enoch, in First Enoch, the author names several of the angels beyond Gabriel and Michael, and I think one of them was Raphael. And I apologize.
Kind of late now, but I just looked up that primavera actually means spring.
Oh, okay,
Makes sense with the plants and the.
yeah, I guess. Okay, here's some of his paintings. There's Madonna with the Christ child. And Saint Jerome is there, and Saint Francis are there with Mary and Jesus. Raphael is known for his sweet-faced Madonnas. He started using more roundishness in his faces. He was able to capture tranquil beauty in many religious works. Frequently described as a pious man with an easy temperament, his one weakness appears to have been women, which proved to be a distraction from his work from time to time. Raphael's first project was the decoration of a room, probably intended by Pope Julius II as his personal library. Each wall represented one of the 4 paths to human wisdom: theology, one wall; philosophy, another wall; poetry, another wall; and law. The philosophy wall contains what has become known as School of Athens, which shows in the center Plato and Aristotle walking together. You see them there? A little fuzzy. I think we've talked about this before when we talked about Plato and Aristotle. I'm sure you remember everything that we talked about then. Which one of them is pointing up and the other is going like this. Do you remember which one's pointing up? Indicating is focusing on the ideal, that truth is only to be gained from the non-material. It's the spirit world that we don't see, that's the reality. That would be Plato. Remember, Plato did not believe that the physical world we see was the real world. It was only a shadow of the reality, which was in a more spiritual world. And so he's pointing up, indicating that. Aristotle is pointing down to the earth, indicating his commitment to the observation of reality. This is reality. This is what we observe, what we focus on. And interestingly, Aristotle was the pupil of Plato, and they came to diametrically opposed ideas about reality, or what's called ontology. And the rest of these guys are all philosophers. I couldn't begin to tell you who they all are without a program. But here's a close-up of Plato and Aristotle. You can see Plato pointing up, Aristotle with his hand extended, both carrying books. And then on this other close-up, Raphael did paint himself into this. So we got Raphael, Zoroaster, who is the founder of Zoroastrianism. It was a form of monotheism in a polytheistic world. Many of the Magi became Zoroastrian. Ptolemy, I'm familiar with, the Greek philosopher, and Perugino, I don't know him. And is that the same one I thought was Raphael? No. Oh, I had the wrong guy. This is Raphael. I wonder, I didn't think he had a beard. That's Raphael. So that's probably Zoroaster. Oh, I don't know who's who, but that's apparently Raphael from the next picture. Euclid, who gave us geometry. Apparently that's him. Zoroaster and Ptolemy. There, as we indicated before. Okay, we'll do one more of the Italian painters here, and that's Michelangelo, who we've already mentioned. You can see he was born near Florence. And in my estimation, in his total ability in many different areas, second only to Da Vinci. I'm sure there's disagreement about that. A genius, also talented as a painter, sculptor, poet, architect. That's really his first name. While learning his art in Florence, Michelangelo was able to mingle with some of the sharpest minds and most gifted humanists of the period, and to study many examples of classical art, as well as the radical new styles of early Renaissance artists, such as the painter Masaccio and the sculptor Donatello. On a cartoon that mentions him. Hi, and Lois. Lois says, "You missed a spot." Hi says, "Do you think Michelangelo's wife said that when he was painting the Sistine Chapel?" And here's probably one of the most famous parts of the Sistine Chapel. God creating man, giving him the spark of life. Here's another painting from the Sistine Chapel. This is the Last Judgment from the Sistine Chapel. I'm going to show you a couple close-ups of it. And then next week, I'll hopefully show you a presentation that goes through all of the Sistine Chapel paintings. While he was doing this, it took him a lot longer than the Pope wanted. And so he was under pressure from the Pope to finish the work, and he felt under constraint. Let's see, I got to move this. So on the left there, Michelangelo painted himself as the flayed Saint Bartholomew. So Saint Bartholomew was skinned alive apparently, and so Michelangelo painted himself because he felt like the Pope was putting too much pressure on him. Right part of the fresco below the group of saints is the resurrection of the body, and the damned are being sucked down into hell. Probably see that more clearly with the presentation. And here on the left, I think are people that are in hell. See the snake wrapped around and so on. And on the right are those that are in heaven, it looks like. Except in poor St. Bartholomew there. Now, one of the things that I just found out not too many years ago is that in addition to being influenced by these classical artists, these Renaissance artists himself, his spiritual life also was influenced by the reformer Savonarola, who preached against the Medici's abuse of power. Remember, the Medicis were the bankers of Florence, who had a lot of power in Florence, but then also had power over the papacy and even became popes. And so Savonarola preached against them, as well as the indulgent and immoral lifestyle of civil leaders and clergy alike, including the Pope. And Michelangelo was converted to Christ, quite possibly through the preaching of Savonarola, and began to change how he painted a lot of things. Started painting things that were not just the nude bodies all the time, at least. When people saw the finished product after 4 years of toil of the Sistine Chapel, he was proclaimed the greatest living artist. But Pope Julius was not so easily pleased. He complained, it really ought to be retouched with gold. It will look poor. Well, not crazy about rebuilding the scaffolding to retouch it with gold. Michelangelo answered, those who are depicted there, they were poor too. Later, he was commissioned to paint around the altar in the Sistine Chapel. He did not take kindly to criticism. So when a papal employee complained about nudity in the unfinished work, Michelangelo painted him into the scene as the Prince of Hell. Although a wealthy man in his later years, Michelangelo lived very frugally, often giving away his works as gifts and even providing dowries for girls too poor to otherwise marry. He did not take good care of himself, working himself to exhaustion and eating and sleeping a little. Sometimes he rose in the middle of the night to work, wearing a paper hat with a candle in the middle of it so he could see while keeping his hands free. He often wore his boots for months at a time, so that when he finally removed them, the outer layer of skin came off as well. different times.
It's just artisan.
Artists in general, yeah. Okay. Next week, we'll look at, hopefully we'll look at a more in-depth view of the Sistine Chapel works, and it'll be a lot clearer. You'll be able to see things. It's remarkable. There was somebody there when we were viewing, who had been to the Sistine Chapel, and they commented that they could see the paintings so much better here than they could when they were over there. So hopefully you'll enjoy that. And then we'll get into some other painters, some in Venice, and then we'll go to Northern Europe and to Spain, and then hopefully talk about some music as well. All right, any comments or questions about Michelangelo or any other painters that we looked at tonight?
You would use such a blue background.
Yeah, it is very bright, isn't it?
Yeah. People themselves are so dark or whatever.
Now think about, and you're looking at the expression here. This must be a demon or something like that one, right? You know, this guy too. This one's making a face like some of your children do when they're taking a picture. But you know, the eyes bulging out there. Expressions on their faces. Any other comments? All right,
What was the music of the musicians? That was
music?
Free, like when the golden age of the classical, wasn't it free that?
I'm sorry, what?
The music of the Renaissance, that wasn't, I mean, Bach and that didn't come till.
Oh, no, that's later.
So was it, I'm not sure who the musicians were back there, but you know,
Yeah, well, we're gonna get to that later.
that was the same.
Remember the music of the church.
His instruments hadn't really developed at that point, had they? I mean, they took a big leap with like the next.
Yeah, I think in the Renaissance there is a leap, just like there is in everything else. But there were people that made their living as musicians, traveling around, singing ballads and things like that as well.
But
Using-
those they didn't take off till a little bit on, but.
Right, what we consider the classical composers.
Yeah.
Like Bach and Beethoven. Yeah, that's later. A couple hundred years later. But there will be some music. We'll try to examine that as well.
The church still the Gregorian chant.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
I haven't researched that much yet.
Or the picture that, the sound of the name on it.
Oh, can you see it?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, there it is. Cool. You want to walk around and show everybody? Michelangelo's signature on across Mary's chest.
In the sash or something.
Yeah.
It's like a Roman type thing, you know?
It does. It looks like. You can move this